It is now 6:05, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time who made it here. Thank you. Thank you all so much for joining us here tonight for our COVID-19 and wellness webinar. Um, I am Tania Cookson Mohammed. I am Community Outreach Coordinator here at CARE. And Jackson, I'll let you introduce yourself. I'm Jackson here, manning all the
Hi everyone, I'm Jackson Higginbottom, pronouncer he, him, and I am the communications coordinator for COVID work.
And I will do a brief intro for our guest speaker here this evening. We have Dr. Nupur Garg, and she is a dual board certified physician in emergency medicine and lifestyle medicine, an MIT and Yale med grad. She currently runs her own private practice and primary care clinic in North Haven. Her clinic has a primary focus on lifestyle medicine, which is concerned with prioritizing healthy lifestyle modifications as prevention and treatments for chronic diseases. She is also a published author of lifestyle medicine, is also creating a lifestyle medicine focused app. And with that, I would like to turn it over to you, Dr. Garg.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here. I know, you probably heard a lot about COVID in the last few years. And I want to say that I think this is going to be a little different than some of the talks that you've heard. But we will go over some of the basic concepts because just so that we're all on the same page, but there are going to be some new information, I think, that will hopefully be interesting to you all. And also will potentially benefit you not just with COVID and potential side effects of COVID, but for other aspects of your life too. And we'll talk about that. So as I mentioned, we are here for COVID. This is the cool diagram I found online of what the actual molecule looks like, this virus. And moving on, so let's begin. So let's pretend that our country is actually a small community of about 50 people, and each person in our community is represented by a different state. Now, for COVID to get from person to person, it actually has to take the interstate. And if we wanted to stop COVID from going from state to state, then, or especially into our state, then we could potentially put up roadblocks. So roadblocks come in different types. We can use flimsy roadblocks, and we can also have partial roadblocks, or we could have cement roadblocks, and we can put them in a way that's pretty effective. Still, some sneaky viruses can get past roadblocks. However, they do help a lot. But it's good to note that, they don't get the job 100% done, and almost nothing in healthcare is actually 100%. So this isn't atypical. But there's also other downsides of potential roadblocks, like going with our analogy. Sometimes people have way too much exposure, and sometimes those exposures are necessary. So for example, some people have to go to jobs, for example, where COVID is everywhere. I know I also work in the emergency department as an emergency physician, and there's COVID everywhere. I'm still thankful for the protections I could put into place on the job, knowing that they're not 100% effective, but it's not foolproof and it's not a great long-term solution. Also, another thing to worry about is our children. In the US, it's not recommended to mask below the age of 3. And that's mainly for developmental reasons. And the WHO actually doesn't recommend masking below the age of 5. And the European CDC, which is their equivalent of our CDC, doesn't recommend masking children below the age of 12. So the bottom line for masks, if you can do it, it can help, but they're not foolproof, and they're just not a great long-term solution for this, for COVID. So back to our analogy, let's see what happens if our virus gets past our roadblocks and now gets into our state. The virus has one goal, and that's to make as many copies of itself as it can. And to do that, it has to find copy machines, which are located in office buildings or cells in our body. Fortunately, this virus only has keys to certain kinds of office buildings. And so it has to find the specific type of office buildings that it has keys to. The way it does that is through the proteins on the outside of the virus. I don't know if you can see my mouth here, but these red things on the outside, basically hanging its keys outside of itself, looking for the right kind of lock. And down here, you'll see kind of like a diagram to scale of the virus holding its keys out, looking for a lock that can fit into that those keys can fit into. And if it finds that, and in COVID's case, that lock is called the ACE2 receptor. And if it finds this ACE2 receptor, which we're going to be talking about a lot, then this cell will let the COVID virus get into it. Once the virus is in the cell, then it wants to make as many copies as it can. And it uses your own cell's energy and your own cell's products, resources like proteins and things like that to reproduce itself. Then the virus just leaves the building through the cell's normal pathways of exits or the office's normal exits. And when it does that, it can go and try to find more buildings to try to get into and make copies of itself. And also it can try to get past more state borders and go into other people and try to go into their cells and office buildings and make copies of itself. Sometimes if the virus can't get out, it can actually make so many copies that it can break open, basically the office building can break open with all the virus copies, and that's how it can get released. So it can be toxic to cells as well, and it often can be. So what I just described is actually the life cycle of all viruses, not just COVID. Different viruses have different roads or interstates that they can take to get into our bodies. And they also have different keys on the outside that they use to get into different kinds of cells. On the right-hand side, you can see all the different ways that viruses can enter our bodies. And we can use different barriers like roadblocks. For COVID's case, that would be a face mask. But for West Nile virus, for example, we would use maybe bug spray to avoid getting bit by a mosquito. And sexually transmitted infections, you can use condoms to avoid contact with the potential viruses. So there's definitely other ways that we protect ourselves from viruses. But again, those are not 100% foolproof all the time. And so sometimes we need another layer of protection. And that is oftentimes in the form of a vaccine. So with vaccines, what we can, this is the virus protecting itself against the barriers. And so with vaccines, what we do is we make use of the keys that are on the outside of COVID or any kind of virus, and we can make copies of those keys and give those copies to our bodies to understand and say, if anybody shows up with a copy of this key, then don't let them in the building. So we show those copies to our police force, our internal police force, which is like our immune system. And it alerts them to the presence of a potential danger to these kinds of cells, and they can stand guard. Usually we can just make copies of the keys externally from our body and inject that into our bodies to accomplish this. When we tried doing that for COVID, there were a lot of problems and a lot of side effects for people. So instead, for this particular virus, we actually decided to teach our own cells how to make a copy of the keys themselves, to then teach our police force what to look out for. So the way it does that is it needs instructions. These instructions are located actually inside the virus itself, among thousands of other pages of instructions here. We only need a few pages of instructions that we copy and then put package together into these particles that we then can inject into our bodies. And once we get these instructions, we put them in what we call lipo nanoparticles, or LNPs. And that's that outer layer that I was telling you about. This protects these instructions, or the mRNA, from the external cellular, the extracellular types of things that it can run into. And it allows the cells to find these particles and grab them and bring them into cells. So then a small portion of these instructions actually ends up escaping and teaches our cells how to make the keys. The keys then get excreted from the cells and presents to our police force. This is what the copies of the keys look like that we don't want to, we don't want those keys to get into our cells. And then we have an extra layer of protection against those viruses. I just want to say one thing about this outer layer, though. It's called LNPs again. It's made out of cholesterol and lipids, including 3 different kinds of lipids. One of them, called ionizable lipids, is actually what we see all these pluses and minuses from, because it's ions, they're ionizable, they can make plus or minus ions, and it's actually extremely inflammatory. So they did an experiment where they injected either saline or non-ionizable lipid LNP or ionizable lipid LNP into mice. And they took samples of their tissue, and they actually published this picture in the results to show that you can visibly see the effects of the inflammation when you're injecting the LNP with ionizable lipid. The amount that they put in the COVID vaccine is less, but it's still there, and it's still inflammatory. So in some ways, the pro-inflammatory nature of that particular outer coating helps get your immune system, your police force, primed for the next step of being able to recognize the keys that we want to try to avoid letting into our cells. And so it allows the immune system to kind of ramp up so it's ready to see what keys there are that are going to get made. But in some ways, this highly inflammatory response is actually implicated as the reason why some people end up having severe reactions to COVID vaccines. The mRNA and the key presenting process that does present some immune response, usually that's on the order of one of our typical vaccines, though, that we usually get. But this ionizable lipid aspect is new, as well as the mRNA aspect. And so this is also, it can propagate our immune response, and that can lead to some of the symptoms that we've heard about. So there's still more research to be done about that. Overall, it's not like a very dangerous thing to happen. There are obviously cases of severe vaccine reactions, but this is something that we can rest assured that it's something that is not supposed to be super toxic in the amounts that they are putting in us. And when our body, basically just to finish up the vaccines, when our body does have the vaccines and the keys get recognized by our immune system, it makes what we call neutralizing antibodies. So here you have COVID coming into your body, into your state, looking for an office building to get into. And the neutralizing antibody will actually cover up all the keys and not let them plug into this lock and not let them in the cell. Versus over here, you can see how the key fits nicely in the cell and that virus starts to replicate. So that's kind of how that works. And then going forward, one thing that comes up as a question is, do we know if our bodies are strong enough to withstand the sort of inflammatory storm that gets precipitated by the LNP coating and the response to the spike protein? And there's not really a quantified way to predict that for each person. But one thing we do know is that there's a much higher chance of a long-term effect from an actual COVID infection than a side effect from the vaccine. And I'm going to be explaining that next when I talk about what happens if COVID does is allowed to replicate itself in your body. And there's also another rarely asked question, in my opinion, but it's important. And it's, is there anything that you can do to make sure that you're going to come out of the vaccine with no lasting side effects? And along with that, come out of having a COVID infection with no to minimal lasting side effects. And I will be going through that part in depth in the end. And there are a ton of things that you can be doing. So that's what we're going to be doing after this section. One more thing about vaccines that's beneficial is that their contagiousness about the vaccines when somebody's fully vaccinated is 3 to 5 days less than if somebody was not fully vaccinated. So you have that going for you as well. So now let's get back to our virus. So it made its way into the Wright office building. It got inside through the lock called the ACE2, and it was allowed to replicate itself. And it activated all kinds of immune responses and what we call cytokines, which are kind of like our immune messaging systems. And those got released, causing symptoms, inflammation symptoms, mucousy symptoms in the form of COVID-19. So another thing which can happen with COVID-19 infections is if somebody has comorbidities. So in this case, that's, for example, hypertension, diabetes, and also a COVID infection does this. But basically, you can see that it will eventually, what we call, stop the ACE2 receptor from functioning in a good way, and it will activate a bad side of our immune response to further increase inflammation, and that will lead to our symptoms being significantly worse, and we get severe symptoms. And that's kind of how, this is kind of the area that we can modify through ourselves. And that's kind of how we could try to limit our response to COVID and not to get to a severe point. And so we'll be talking about that. So more on that. So this is how you could see where COVID is impacting the ACE2 receptor, where normally when that gets triggered, it wants to go into this less inflammatory side of the balance, where it's your blood pressure gets lower, you're not making a lot of fibrosis or scar tissue, you're not killing your cells. That's what this means. You don't have a lot of free radical oxygen going around, and it's anti-inflammatory. But instead, once these receptors get blocked or downregulated, then you actually go into this side, and it tips this balance over to getting higher blood pressure, more scar tissue, more cell death, more stress on your cells from the free radical oxygen, more damage to your cells, and then also more inflammation. And you can see that ACE2 receptor and this whole system is actually very prevalent all over your body. You can see that this kind of system, you will see the effects of all over in so many different ways. So in your bone marrow, it will make it more thrombotic and inflammatory, so you'll get more clots. You can have severe lung injury in your lungs, which we talked about. Your endocrine system, you get insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome. Heart, you can end up getting, like what we talked about, high blood pressure, but also cardiomyopathies. And this is the way that young people die, because if the COVID just gets into the wrong ACE2 receptor, and even if the rest of your body is fine, but it gets into the heart, then your heart can actually fail. And the 1 to 2 deaths a year we saw of flu, for example, for years, and I had seen in my own lifetime in the emergency department, in really healthy young people, is because the flu just traveled to that specific place in their body, their heart, and their heart was affected. And so it's really unfortunate. And like I said, nothing is foolproof. If you get vaccines or masks, whatever, there's always a little chance like that. But this is a dangerous place for the COVID to be. Also, the central nervous system, obviously, your kidney function gets affected, and then your liver. And the liver problem is that once you start having problems there, it doesn't eliminate the toxins as well, because your liver is actually what will end up healing some of these fibrosis issues and inflammation issues. So it can reduce your body's power to heal from COVID. And this is another kind of diagram of where all we can see these ACE2 receptors and the different types of cells that the ACE2 actually exists on. And so this had a few more things here that where COVID can really get into and cause a lot of problems. And the interesting thing, like, that you should probably know as well, is that, like, the vaccine doesn't target these same receptors or these same cells. The vaccine just targets immune system cells, dendritic cells, to get into. And so it's not trying to get into these cells, it's trying to get into those cells just to be able to make a copy of the key to present to the immune system. And that immune system will then help protect these cells. So just so you know, the responses that people have to the vaccine are often not exactly the same as COVID for a reason. You know, it's not supposed to be mimicking the virus as much as just like I explained, presenting the key. So the next thing I want to talk to you about is about long COVID. So how does that start? So first you have your cytokine release and inflammation, like we went through, and that's from an acute COVID reaction. And that causes symptoms. So cytokines are actually really prone to causing things like headaches or pain and inflammation, especially if you get swelling somewhere, you get pain in that area. You can get shortness of breath, you can get anxiety, and then that causes stress, whether it's your body stressed because of lack of sleep and it's not healing, or just emotional stress or overexertional stress. And stress is then a pro-inflammatory state. And that then increases the cycle of inflammation, causing, again, symptoms and causing more stress. So this is how you end up getting chronic inflammation. This is actually not specific to just COVID either. So many of these things are prevalent in so many other processes that we see in healthcare everywhere. But in COVID, it's quite a difficult cycle to break sometimes because of the amount of damage that gets done with the infection and how much healing needs to take place to break this cycle. And so with long COVID, you get other kinds of like long-term problems. And you can see that here. You can get things like cardiac impairment, POTS disease, diabetes. You can get autoimmune disease coming up. MCAS is a popular one in children. And then dysautonomia, chronic fatigue syndrome. And so you end up getting a lot of different chronic problems. And this chronic state of inflammation actually leads to problems like hyperlipidemia or high cholesterol, which will then, in atherosclerosis, that will then, you know, deposit your cholesterol along your vessels and then leads to problems like heart attacks and strokes. And so those are all kinds of some of the chronic problems that and bad events that can happen from just sort of like the cycle of events that starts with this and then goes to this and goes to this and then goes to that. And we see that in COVID a lot. So the next thing, let's see if I can go forward. Oh yeah, the one thing that came up in my research for this talk is today is actually Long COVID Awareness Day. And this was a poster I came across that I thought I'd put in my talk because it mentions some of the things that, you know, why are we talking about long COVID? Every infection increases your risk. It's every organ, every system, every body. COVID impacts every part of your life, that kind of thing. And then there's also something about here about high risk for COVID infections and are often denied appropriate health care for ongoing symptoms. So it's really about kind of like giving awareness to people who might have ongoing symptoms that are not readily recognized by the medical community, and kind of just you know, giving them a voice. So I thought it was just interesting because it happens to be today, and I think we didn't even know this, like, right, Tony, when we were scheduling this talk. That's kind of a nice coincidence. This is another comic I found that I thought I'd put in this talk, basically showing that everybody's experience with COVID is very different. The quote that we hear about is that most people recover within 1 to 2 weeks without needing medical treatment. And that is true. But there are definitely a lot of people that end up having other experiences. And you can see some of the signs posted in this comic here. So what are our options? Well, the good news is there are actually developments in research, and I'll go through this slide. I know it's a very complicated, tricky slide, but basically they just published something, I think 1.5 weeks ago, where they were comparing, they were looking at what they call COVID long haulers or long COVID patients. And patients, basically they were tracking the days in which they were having symptoms, and they were comparing it to people who didn't receive anything, people who received ivermectin, people who received metformin, and people who also received fluvoxamine. And then they showed, and then also different combinations of these things. And they showed basically that, and this particular study that was looking at metformin, and in all of these arms, actually, they were looking at people who had a diagnosis of obesity. So that's one important thing that is important to keep in mind. So in the red in all of these diagrams is the placebo. Well, actually in the red solid line, sorry, the red solid line in all of these diagrams is the placebo, which no one knew that they were getting the placebo, but they did get the placebo. And what that means is they didn't get any treatment. And then the other lines, the blue ones and the other dashed lines are where they were getting some of the other treatments. So what you can see is that for metformin specifically, they actually showed a benefit in patients who took metformin, obese patients who took metformin, compared against the controls, the placebos. And the people who took metformin had a significant, almost like 30 to 40% reduction in symptoms compared to people who were having no treatment. With ivermectin, the jury was still out. There didn't appear to be a difference in this particular population. And fluvoxamine actually looks like it might have worsened some of people's symptoms, or at least in this particular population, some people's symptoms got worse over time, and they happen to be in this group. And then over here, I mean, I won't go through this, but this is like the combinations of the different kinds of drugs. And you can see like the ones with metformin did perform better overall than the ones without it. So metformin does seem to be a clear winner. The other two did not prove themselves well in this study. And so I do sort of like recommend, oh, this is incorrect. I was just using this, by the way, no treatment for this particular box. But I do sort of recommend you talking to your doctor about this option if it seems like something that would be beneficial for you if you do have long COVID, because this is like a brand new study that just came out. So that's kind of exciting. And then going back to our pathway of chronic inflammation, what else can be done besides medications? And that's kind of where my specialty comes in of lifestyle medicine. So lifestyle medicine is something that I kind of like found out about a few years ago. I fell in love with. I opened up a practice in it. I wrote a book in it. And I just love practicing in it. And it basically concerns itself with 6 different pillars of our lifestyle. So we have healthful eating, diet, nutrition, we have physical activity, emotional well-being, avoiding risky substances and environments, sleep, and then social connectedness. And this is kind of like a summary of all the recommendations, and I'll go through each one for how it can impact you so that you might be able to mitigate the effects of COVID. And the way that the way that we would recommend going about this is to focus on an anti-inflammatory lifestyle. Because as we noted earlier, the inflammation that COVID causes is what does a lot of the damage that we see from COVID and also the vaccine. And I tell my patients this all the time, like I live such an anti-inflammatory lifestyle right now. And I have literally, I mean, some people here know this, I've been exposed to COVID so much sometimes, like literally I wasn't wearing a mask for 2 hours talking to somebody right here and I didn't get a single symptom, and I am fully vaccinated. However, the same, and I didn't get a lot of symptoms for the vaccine. The same reason I'm not worried about kind of like COVID a lot of times or exposures is the same reason I'm not worried about getting the COVID vaccine, is because of how anti-inflammatory I focus on in my lifestyle. And so I want to teach you some of those types of things that you can start to employ in your lifestyle. So the most important thing that you could probably do is look at your diet. And this is the anti-inflammatory diet pyramid. And I'm going to go through this step by step. This is probably, like, I would say at least 50% of what you can do. And it starts at the base. And this is where we're going to get, you're probably going to not be excited about, but it starts at the base with vegetables and fruits. As minimally processed as possible is better, but sometimes you have to process something to eat it, and that's okay. But in general, ultra processed food you want to eliminate. In general, heavily processed foods you want to eliminate. You want to stick to light processed food as much as possible, or medium processed. So vegetables and fruits. If you look at this, it says 4 to 5 a day minimum. What that means is 4 to 5 servings a day minimum. And then fruits 3 to 4 a day minimum. What I like to tell my patients is 10 servings a day, at least half being vegetables. I strive for 10 servings a day. I rarely get it. I'm definitely over 6, but it's a really good thing to try to target as a goal. And what we like to say is eat the rainbow. So a variety is important. You get different nutrients, different antioxidants, different anti-inflammatory compounds, different micronutrients, different, just so many different kinds of benefits from all the different kinds of vegetables and fruits that are out there. And that's really where everything starts here. So incorporating that into your diet, there's only so much you can eat in a day, and this takes a lot of the room in your diet. And so the rest of it is sort of like significantly less in terms of what you want to try to eat during your day. You want to stick to all whole grains, minimally sort of like processed pasta, and then beans and legumes for some of your proteins and carbs and whole grains and fibers. And this will, none of this stuff adds any inflammation. In fact, it absorbs a lot of the inflammation. These two categories will give you enough fiber to be able to withstand a lot of different impacts to our bodies. Also healthy fats. So what I like to say is any fat that's solid at room temperature, you want to try to avoid. Any fat that is liquid at room temperature, so that's extra virgin olive oil, the fats from some nuts and avocados, those are good fats. Coconut oil, bad fat. I know my parents are on this. Ghee is a bad fat. And any kind of lard, any kind of chicken fat, or like, meat fat, that would all be bad fats. Okay, so then you want to stick to fish in terms of the protein, some of the extra protein that you might get. These also have a lot of omegas and polyunsaturated fats, which are healthy fats. 2 to 6 a week. Not every day, not 7 a day. It's like 2 to 6 servings a week. And then whole soy foods. This is the edamame, the soy nuts, soy milk tofu. Those are going to be really healthy. Soy is a whole complete protein. So when you're eating soy 1 to 2 times a day, you get your complete proteins. And they're very anti-inflammatory, full of antioxidants. A lot of mushrooms have a lot of benefits. The rest of this stuff is, sparing. This is the base of what you want to be eating. And then everything else is sort of just like flavoring. Some things that I want to point out are this healthy herbs and spices. For my holiday gift that I gave all my patients, I gave them little turmeric shakers so they can keep it at their table and just put it on their food. So I want to encourage you all to do that. Ginger is also anti-inflammatory, cinnamon, garlic. Oh yeah, here's garlic. And so you can have unlimited amounts of this stuff. They don't add calories. It's good flavoring. Some teas are anti-inflammatory. Some supplements can be anti-inflammatory. It really depends on your type of body, what you're able to absorb, what you tend to not absorb, what your diet is like. Are you eating enough dark leafy green vegetables? And that's how you could come to what kind of supplements might be ideal for you. But it's not, like it says supplements, it's like not like all the supplements everywhere. It should be talked about with somebody, like a professional, to understand your system and what's going on. And the red wine optional, healthy sweets optional, sparingly. That's also on this. So foods that you remember, it says small amounts are okay. I put not here because I don't think they're okay. I'm sort of joking, but sort of not. And so basically on this list, you have any fried foods, any fast foods, any refined grains, so white rice, white flours, any red meat. The WHO classifies processed red meat as a class 1 carcinogen. It's super pro-inflammatory and pro-cancerous. And any desserts and sugary drinks. And these two are just basically sugar. Processed sugar, your body doesn't need for any reason, unless you are starving for calories and you need the energy, which most of us aren't. You don't need the sugar. It doesn't have any nutrients, and it's super pro-inflammatory. So that would be, but it's highly addictive. So if you were to start working on anything today, it would be sort of like working on getting rid of the sugar. And it may take you a long time to do that, but every effort matters. And this will really help calm down your immune system. Another thing that you should know is about fat. Fat is an obesity, actually. Obesity is a pro-inflammatory state. Obesity actually increases the inflammation because fat cells actually can recruit what we call macrophages, which are part of the inflammatory process, and it signals the production of more inflammatory cells. And that's part of what leads to cardiovascular disease, and it's part of what leads to pancreatic damage that leads to the diabetes. And it's also part of what makes cancer more likely in obese patients. And so this is all part of the pro-inflammatory nature of fat. And so that is something that anything that will lead to more fat will be worsening your inflammatory state. Sedentariness, aging, inactivity will lead to adiposity, fat stores, and will lead to pro-inflammation. Also, but exercise, and I'm talking about skeletal muscle exercise, can actually stop this chronic low-grade inflammation that's caused by fat. And it can stop the fat leading to worsened musculoskeletal diseases and worsened metabolic diseases from this chronic low-grade inflammation. So exercise is another component of your lifestyle that will help decrease your inflammatory response to potential pathogens and having less of a long-term effect from COVID. Another thing is stress. So this is a really, really complicated slide just to say that stress is pro-inflammatory. And you can see it's like basically when you're stressed, there's no brakes for cortisol anymore. And then so with that, your stress and your inflammation just keeps driving up. And so basically what you can do from that, from a mindfulness, from an emotional well-being perspective, there are so many different kinds of therapies. So for example, bibliotherapy is reading books, mindfulness awareness, there's formal mindfulness, there's meditation, there's breathing exercises where you actually stop what you're doing and then try to be mindful. But then there's also informal mindfulness, which is just like being present in the moment, being responsive and not reactive, taking time to sort of like process everything. And all of that can really help calm yourself and decrease your stress. If stress is coming from a certain part of your life, then address that part of your life. For things like work and excess work, we also recommend in lifestyle medicine to downshift to decrease that level of stress on your body, because that has toxic effects and is pro-inflammatory. So that's another area that we can do something about. Another one is avoiding toxic substances and environments. And I count sugar as a toxic substance because there's no benefit to it. But there's also other kinds of toxic substances. Too much alcohol, too much caffeine are toxic substances. Obviously tobacco, drugs, those are toxic substances. Here we have toxic environments. You can also get heavy metal toxins from different kinds of exposures that you have. This is asbestos, it's supposed to be asbestos, this is mold. So all of these are pro-inflammatory. You know, they're going to propagate some symptoms. They're going to propagate your immune responses in ways that you don't want. And all of these are going to have a negative impact on your response to COVID as well. And the last thing is social connectedness. So loneliness has been associated with a lot of pro-inflammatory types of conditions. They're all kind of related, right? But it definitely does lead to the chronic release of the cortisol. And but also it's been linked to chronic disorders, possibly through this pro-inflammatory pathway, or at least, like I said, it's linked. One thing that I like to tell my patients with loneliness is that, there's two parts to it. There's your purpose, which gives you a sense of sort of identity and place in this world. And that's important to try to go after. And there's also community. So it could be in whatever form you want. However, it's important to find a group of people or people that are sort of similar enough to you, or either it could be value-based or family-based or whatever it is that you feel like you belong in. And that way you can mitigate the effects of loneliness on you. And so the rest of this is sort of like just exercise that I found interesting in my research. They call COVID the inequity virus because it concentrated wealth in people who were wealthy, and it decreased wealth in people who weren't wealthy. So that was one thing I found. And then the other thing this picture was interesting about is this number of children. I feel like people who didn't have children during the pandemic had the last laugh. Does anybody else feel like that? Everyone who had children was like going crazy. And everybody who didn't were like laughing at it. So this is like another, like this kind of reminded me of that. But that's another thing about COVID that I found. And yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gard. That was fantastic. So much information in this amount of time, like short amount of time that we've been together. Thank you. Thank you. I did get a couple of questions in the chat. We have a few minutes left before we end at 7. So are you ready? I have a few questions for you.
Is it already 7? It can't be. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I missed it. All right. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions. All right. So first one here we have, does getting the vaccination help prevent long COVID if you do end up getting COVID? So does getting the vaccination help with that?
You know, I don't know if enough has been quantified about that. I'm not sure. I think like in terms of what I think about with long COVID, I think of it as something that, and I was just talking about this with one of my patients today, I think of it as something that is not fully eradicated in some people. And it could be something that, like we talked about, it could be like lying dormant or something. And in certain people we're just so inflamed all the time that we're constantly experiencing the effects of that sort of like that virus or the effects of the virus. And we never really got to break the cycle. But in terms of the vaccine trying to prevent that, you know, I don't like 100% know if that's the case. I think it has better chances. If anything could prevent it, I think it could. I wouldn't see if yeah, you know what the other problem is, like, how do you even identify long COVID people? You know, like the way that they did in the study was like by their symptoms. And so I think if you did that and then you looked at like if they had the vaccine, then that would be, I think all the people in the study, by the way, were fully vaccinated in the study with the metformin. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So we have a few more questions.
Yeah.
Someone is asking, where can they get your book?
Oh, okay. It's on Amazon. I guess you can email me, and I can also, if you're local, I will just like give you a very cheaper version of it, so you don't have to pay Amazon, because I get like a cheaper version that I can just like give out. But you can always just email me. My email address is on my website, lifestyleandfamilymedicine@gmail.com. It's designed for physicians to ace the lifestyle medicine board exam. I knew I was going to practice in it from the beginning, and I wanted my own sort of like tables and charts. So I worked with my study buddies that I studied with for the exam. One is a pediatrician, one is an ENT physician. And we like used our study materials and kind of combined it into a book, and people loved it. I mean, it's well reviewed, but it was like my first publishing thing, so I'm really excited. But I'm happy to sort of like give you a cheaper version of it so that you don't have to buy it, because especially if you're not a physician, I don't expect you to use it the same way.
Okay. Oh, so now they're all popping in.
Yeah.
So I know we won't have time to get all of them, but we'll try to
That's
get
okay,
as
I'll
many
try
as
to
we
keep it
can.
fast.
Yeah, I already had some, but now like there's more coming. All right, so let's see. Someone asked why al dente for pasta?
I think the more processed something is, so the longer you cook it, like a very slow roast of something, or the higher the heat and the longer you cook it, the more processed. So that just goes in just a less processing of the pasta. That's the reason.
All right, thank you.
And the more processed it is, the more nutrients it takes out. Sorry, the more fiber it takes out, so that's why we don't like processing. So but yeah, so we just want to keep it as minimally processed as you need to eat the foods typically. Although some foods, like I said, like with carrots, for example, you get benefits from unprocessed carrots and you get benefits from processed carrots. So you just kind of have to know what you like, but like you can't go really wrong with eating mostly unprocessed. So.
Thank you. All right, so what are your thoughts about supplements?
I like them. I think that, the supplement industry is so enormous. So during COVID, it went from like the supplement industry grew, I think like threefold. It was like $5 billion industry, and then went to 15. I think like people got a little bit supplement happy during that time. I think if you have the right information to guide you and your body, and you know what your body is, what the state of your body is in terms of all the different ingredients that are in the supplement, then they're okay. I prefer powder supplements because you don't get the capsule part, which again is like a very highly processed thing that your body doesn't need to have to figure out how to digest. So powdered supplements are better, that you could just like kind of like add to like a drink or something. And I also like highly recommend you discussing that with your physician. Unfortunately, like lifestyle medicine is an extra certification. I feel like all physicians should know this basic stuff, because I feel like that should be the primary way we treat patients. But sometimes you're going to run into this problem where they're not going to want to advise you on supplements. There are other sources out there, but then sometimes those sources are pushing their branding supplements. And it's like, I just think that there's not a good source sometimes for all of this stuff. I have had people come in, they're on like 20 supplements, and then we do their labs, and like their selenium is off their charts, and it's like their hair's falling out. They're always like, we take them off the selenium supplements, and then they're fine again. They have all their energy. So sometimes you can get supplement toxicity. So zinc and selenium are two to look out for. Those are the ones that I've seen in my practice, but there are probably others. But I love learning about, like, I'm a lifelong learner, so I have nothing against it in principle, but you have to do it smartly, not blindly. So yeah.
Excellent, thank you. How can you tell the difference between medium and high processed foods?
That's a really good question. When we take the boards, I mean, it really depends on the food. When we take the boards, they give the example of an apple. So you have an apple, a whole apple, you just bite into an apple off a tree. That's like completely unprocessed. Lightly processed is if you were to peel the apple or slice the apple. And then medium processed is if you were to make applesauce. And then highly processed is like apple pie kind of thing, where you're actually like cooking the apple. Well, I think applesauce is cooking a little bit too, but it's like more cooked. So I think it really just depends on the type of food. But if you're like annihilating something to the point of you can't even recognize it in some kind of food that you're eating, like I see these fruit bars and it's almost like annihilated, you can't even recognize the fruit. It's a little bit, iffy there. I do suggest, I don't think that you have to go 100% in any direction. You can use some of these adjuncts that are processed to get you off some of the really highly toxic foods. And then you can move to like, that's what I did at least. And then you go gradually to like less processed foods. So, so yeah, I think that, it depends on the stage of your transitions, but every step in the right direction is a step away from the wrong direction, you know?
Totally.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see. Do you know what the projected time may be as to when the COVID shot might end up being like the flu shot, like an annual? Have you heard
Yeah,
a
I
timeline?
honestly don't. I think like even the flu has lost a little bit of its seasonality. So the reason why the flu was an annual, and I had done like research on this before, like during as a resident when there was no COVID, and there was like seasonality. There's always the seasonality, and the reason why is because I worked in the emergency department, and we had these huge upticks of people coming in with the flu or whatever. And so the reason why there's that seasonality was because there's like a predictable like pattern of human behavior with the season that goes along with summers and schools and works and things like that, that kind of like can perpetuate a virus in a community. And so with COVID, you have a little bit with after the pandemic and the post-pandemic world that we live in, we're seeing a lot of fluctuations in what our typical seasonalities were. So I think that's what would predict the shot, the shot schedule. It's not necessarily, anything else. That's what the shot schedule would be based on. If it can come to a point of seasonality where it's predictable.
Okay, and I think just because of time, this will probably be the last question. Do you anticipate new COVID variants following and the impact during flu season? Sorry.
I don't know if like cold and flu season is always what it was, that's the technical word for it. So cold and flu is like both colds and flus. Colds are what? They're rhinovirus and coronaviruses. Coronaviruses are highly like what's it called, mutating. They just have and so are rhinoviruses. That's why there was never a cure for them, because they just always mutate. They're just like mutate. They just like there's no end. And so I think like because of that, I think new variants are inevitable. However, many of the mutations are actually to the virus's disadvantage. And so some of them you never hear about because they'll mutate themselves to death. And so, they'll mutate themselves to be weaker. The only ones that you'll hear about are the ones that seem to be kind of like causing either more inflammatory symptoms than the last one, or it becomes more infectious. And so those are the ones that you'll end up hearing about. But yeah, it's sort of inevitable. It's the nature of the coronavirus.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Garg. This was so extremely informative. I want to thank you for everything, and thank all of you for coming and spending this hour with us learning. I just put my email in the chat if you want to reach out. And yeah, Dr. Garg. So either one, if you reach out to me, I can also put you in touch with Dr. Garg. Definitely go out, get the book. Check out, I should probably put, you guys all found your way here, right? So CARE's website. So for any, information on upcoming events, things that we're doing out in the community, take a look at the website. And with that, we'll sign off for the evening. Thank you all again. Good night.
Bye.